In progress.
Great. I believe we are recording, just so you know, not for dissemination broadly, but just so you know, it's being recorded just for our edification. Greetings. My name is Bradley Vines. It's a pleasure to have this chance to talk with you about the neuroscience of improvisation. So excited to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you and to, of course, hear your thoughts and questions as well. Okay, let me share my screen and we can get going. Excellent. All right, you should hopefully have access to a screen. I'm going to have some slides to walk you through or to have to support what I'm discussing. And as you know, we're talking about the neuroscience of improvisation here. This is a relatively new field of research, going back just about 2 decades at this point. The focus has been on improvisation in relation to creativity, flow states, and so on. And that has been very fruitful. In this presentation,
Bradley?
I'm going to, oh, sorry, yeah,
Sorry,
Rob.
before you
Yeah.
jump into it, just a little bit of logistical stuff. Since we do have a pretty large group, if everybody could just please go ahead and mute your microphone. We just want to avoid, the usual background noise issues, but just go ahead and keep yourself on mute. Unless you specifically have a question, then you can unmute yourself. But by default, if you could just go ahead and mute your channel, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, that would be great. There will be an opportunity to hear your voices. I will be sharing some applied insights over the course of this presentation. And every couple of insights, I'll stop to see if there is a question or two. Otherwise, let's see. Mostly, I'm going to be presenting, and then we'll spare some time towards the end to have a discussion and question and answer period as well. Is there still a hum in my mic? Yes, there is. Okay, all right.
I'm not hearing that, Bradley. So I think you're okay. It's just
okay. Sorry about that. If it is coming through for some folks. All right. So as I was saying, so the neuroscience of improvisation has focused on creativity to date. Improvisation being this quintessential example of creative behavior. And there's more to the story, I think, and that's what I'm going to be going into in this presentation, expanding to look at the relationship between states associated with improvisation and those associated with non-dual, transpersonal, and other kinds of experiential states that are being explored in the context of dream research, psychedelics, and meditation. So we will, of course, touch on creativity. You can't not talk about that in the context of improvisation, but I'm looking to expand the conversation a bit with you. Okay, a little background on consciousness, which will be relevant to the discussion. We do not know, as you likely are aware, where consciousness comes from. However, there are some dominant perspectives and theories that are theoretical in nature. And the one that I think is going to be most helpful for us today is adhered to by folks like Anil Seth and others. They refer to waking consciousness as a controlled hallucination. So everything you're experiencing, seeing, hearing, and so on is being generated by the brain. That is the dominant perspective now in cognitive neuroscience. And based on this, all contents of consciousness are the interaction of expectations. What building upon what you know from the past, and sensation. So the five senses plus interoception, which is awareness of internal states, and proprioception, which is awareness of your movement. So your waking consciousness is, according to this perspective, essentially a hallucination that is the meeting of your expectations for the world, your predictions, and a filtering through based upon incoming sensory input. Now, of course, this changes a little bit in the context of dreaming, psychedelics, and other such states, in that the filtering process is increased to an extent. Just a reminder to please, if you haven't muted your phone. So in these kinds of states, you have experiences that are flowing from predictions, from emotional implicit associations, with less of that filtering going on. So you're experiencing things that don't actually align with reality, that is based on sensory input as much. All right. Let's see. Okay, I might just take a moment and make sure people are muted across the board here. So let's see here. Is there anyone having trouble muting? Okay, great. I'll set that. Okay, so the fact of this hallucination is quite clear. We come face to face with this when we look at illusions. So, for example, visual illusions, such as this one to the right that you see, the shepherd illusion. There are many auditory illusions, such as the missing fundamental, which we can discuss later if you're interested. Pareidolia, which is seeing human forms and faces in clouds and other inanimate objects. Phantom limb experiences, as discussed and researched by Ramachandran and others. So when we encounter these illusions, it brings to the fore the fact that you do not directly experience reality, but you are experiencing some kind of creation of the mind. Okay, that's just some background that's going to be helpful as we move through these ideas here related to improvisation. Let's jump right into the most famous improvisation neuroimaging study, and this was conducted by Charles Lim and colleagues. He was at the time at Johns Hopkins. He's now at the University of California, San Francisco, right here in the Bay Area. And what he did was to have jazz pianists, so these were professional improvisers. He had them play in two different ways, in an improvisatory way. So they're improvising over a 12-bar blues form, for example, versus having them play a pre-memorized piece over 12-bar blues forms. So that was the comparison, looking at improvisation versus performance that has similar complexity in terms of the motor requirements for the task, but is pre-learned. So pre-learned versus improvisation, where you don't know, of course, what's going to happen, creating it in the moment. And what he found was quite interesting, and to me, strike me as a bit paradoxical. So I would have thought that improvisation would require more brain activity. After all, it seems more complex. You're having to come up with something in the moment. You're having to create something new. But actually what he found was the dominant finding, the most interesting finding at least, was a dampening down of activity. There was less activity in a certain area of the brain that is, well, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That'll come up a few times, but it's here in the frontal cortex. And that is the area that is responsible for self-control, rational, conscious monitoring, and so on. So this area of the brain that's normally active to help filter what we're doing, help keep us in line, so to speak, with the norms of the situation, was dampened down, interestingly. And there was a concomitant increase in activity in areas involved in sensation and internal motivations, including the medial frontal cortex and areas of somatosensory cortex. So there's this trade-off, it seems, where in the improvisatory state, you have a decrease in self-monitoring and control, volitional control, and an increase in the structures that are involved in internal motivation. Notably, Liu and colleagues found a similar finding, a very similar pattern of results, looking at freestyle rappers, so people that were not jazz pianists, but freestyle rapping artists. And they again compared pre-learned versus improvised states, performance situations, and found a very similar pattern to those that Lim and colleagues found. Okay, now the story isn't quite so simple as, just stop using your self-monitoring and you'll be a fantastic performer and you'll rise to the occasion. It turns out that it's likely that the story is related to your level of experience and also familiarity with the current situation. So David Rosen and colleagues did some very interesting research where they looked at the quality of the improvisation. So not just whether someone was improvising, but how high the quality or enjoyment or pleasure of that improvisation was, based on the performer's own experience, but also listeners, expert improvisers. And what they found in some ways does go along with what Charles Lim and colleagues found, in that when there was decreased activity in frontal regions, the more experienced improvisers had higher quality improvisations. So there was this correlation where the less activity in the frontal areas led to higher quality. However, this was only for the experienced improvisers. Less experienced improvisers saw exactly the opposite trend. So the less activity in frontal regions, the less quality in the improvisations. So this is quite interesting to see that this involves familiarity and experience. And basically there was a replication that Rosen and colleagues conducted where they actually stimulated this prefrontal cortex area using a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation, which allows you to increase or decrease activity in an area. So they increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of the right hemisphere. And they found that this actually impeded quality for the experienced improvisers, whereas it actually improved quality of performance for the less experienced improvisers. So the story is that using these frontal self-monitoring areas might be very helpful when we are less familiar with a particular situation or with a particular piece that we're performing through, or a structure. Think of when you're learning to drive. Of course, when you first start, you want to be quite vigilant and concerned about what you're doing, where you're putting your foot, and so on. But over time, that falls to the background, and you're able to basically do that implicitly. And that's more or less what we're seeing evidence of here in the context of improvisation. So let me switch gears a little bit and look at parallels with other kinds of mental states, starting with dreaming. So dreaming is very interesting, and we've learned a lot about what it looks like in your brain when you're dreaming. So it turns out that the brain activity patterns associated with dreaming are very similar to your waking state. So you have the activation of emotional centers, motor centers, and perceptual areas. But interestingly, and related to what we just saw in the neuroscience of improvisation, is that one of the characteristic changes that is indicative of a dreaming state is the decrease in activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this area that's involved in filtering your experience. And this may be an interesting correlate with improvisation. So Kahneman put it nicely when talking about dreaming states, when he said, there is a more fluid and flexible cognitive processing during REMS, that is rapid eye movement sleep, compared to non-rapid eye movement sleep and waking state. So this fluid and flexible cognitive processing at least aligns with the phenomenology, that is the experience of improvising in a satisfying way, at least. He said that dreaming involves unconscious thought in progress, in which associative mechanisms are less tightly constrained by prefrontal cortical controlled mechanisms, and hence are predominantly driven by underlying emotions. So again, this seems to align with what we might expect for the states associated with improvisation, this freedom of the emotions to express themselves. And finally, he notes that dreaming involves changes in the sense of self, leading to depersonalization, loss of self and body boundaries, and non-dual awareness. And I'm just going to put a flag in that. We're going to get to this in a little bit, exploring these non-dual experiences in relation to improvisation. But it's interesting that we see that in the context of dreaming. So now what if we look at another brain state that is being investigated more and more? There's a reemergence of interest in psychedelics, the experience and therapeutic value of psychedelics, starting with Roland Griffiths and team in the early 2000s, and now centers around the world, Imperial College London, Johns Hopkins, University of Washington, McGill University, so many around the world are exploring these states. Interestingly, psilocybin, which is a classic psychedelic, it is the psychoactive compound present in psychedelic mushrooms, is associated with, amongst many changes in the brain, a decrease in activity in the frontal cortex, so aligned with what we've been seeing or discussing in terms of improvisation and dreaming. Also disrupted oscillation patterns and network connectivity in frontal cortex. And it has been hypothesized that this change in the activity and relationship between the frontal cortex and the rest of the brain, this could potentially contribute to the reduction in reality testing and the increase in nonlinear thinking, which is characteristic of states of mind associated with psychedelics. So what we're seeing here is a pattern that connects improvisation with the idea of expression, spontaneous expression without filter, so to speak. And this is probably not a new idea for all of you involved in jazz. One of the most famous albums of all time, of course, Kind of Blue, features liner notes by the incomparable Bill Evans, who beautifully writes in these liner notes about an improvisatory art form. These artists must practice a particular discipline, that of allowing the idea to express itself in communication with their hands in such a direct way that deliberation cannot interfere. So this nicely aligns with what we're finding thus far in this young burgeoning field of research on the neuroscience of improvisation, and which also aligns with as mentioned, what we see in dream and psychedelic states. So this leads to applied insight number one. Consider noticing and even potentially modulating the involvement of self-evaluation and volitional control while improvising. As you're practicing or even performing, perhaps, if you're willing to risk it there, can you notice and perhaps even adjust the extent to which you are controlling what is happening with your volition, and alternatively allowing emotional associations to emerge and express themselves. And based on the research by David Rosen, you could consider also doing this in concordance with your familiarity with the particular piece you're playing or context. So new situations and contexts could be better negotiated and navigated by utilizing these wonderful frontal cortices, which have tremendous executive powers for planning and so on. Whereas for a piece you're very familiar with, could you explore letting go of the steering wheel more and seeing what that feels like, what happens, and so on. Okay. So let's move forward and think about what it is you are monitoring when you are using these self-evaluating areas of the brain. I will briefly note that I'm going to be referencing jazz improvisation quite a bit. It's the tradition I'm most familiar with, but of course, improvisation happens across the board in so many different traditions, whether it's Carnatic, Indian, classical, more and more again in Western classical music, and so many other traditions. But you'll see a few quotes that are skewed towards jazz. So Miles Davis famously said, once is a mistake, twice is jazz, emphasizing this point that there's really no such thing as a wrong note when you're improvising. There are no wrong notes on the piano, Thelonious Monk said, and I'm sure you probably have a litany of other examples. I think I've heard Max Roach, Mingus, and so many others say again and again that unexpected events are opportunities for creative development. So when we see an unexpected event, we might not always perceive it that way. With an open mind, we may experience it as an error. Now, errors have been a focus of much research in the world of music cognition and cognitive neuroscience. And this research has shown that errors in music actually reveal the inner workings of the mind. They, for example, may reflect planning or anticipating. So when analyzing the errors of musicians, they often reflect the performer looking forward ahead. So the error actually shows a pattern of movement or concept that is inserted early. So there's some planning going on and it accidentally gets included early as opposed to where it was meant to be in terms of that particular note or pattern. They express habitual motor patterns. So if we have overlearned patterns of movement, they may express themselves. We may intend one thing, but the habitual pattern actually emerges. They will also reflect how the performer conceptualizes the harmonic and melodic structures in which they are currently performing. So, for example, research has shown that when playing a piece, a performer is much more likely to make an error with a note that is within the harmony in which they are currently playing. So there's a high probability that the error will still be within the melodic and harmonic structure that provides the context in which that error is occurring. So basically, these airs are showing internal processes in many different ways. And I wanted to mention an interesting patient that Oliver Sacks writes about, Ray, who has Tourette's syndrome. And Oliver Sacks describes how he is an improvising drummer, famous for his sudden and wild extemporizations, which would arise from a tick or a compulsive hitting of a drum and would instantly be made the nucleus of a wild and wonderful improvisation, so that the sudden intruder would be turned into brilliant advantage. Perhaps I should have reminded us that Tourette's syndrome is, of course, where there's this uncontrollable expression of often unsavory movements and vocalizations that are perhaps unaccepted by society. And so this drummer, this Ray, turned this into a creative expression on the drums. So uncontrollable movements that he would turn into creative ideas. Can we not all look at our so-called airs as ticks of a sort? They are coming from deep inside our implicit learning, our associations, the way that we understand the context, the musical context, and so on. So this aligns with another statement by Bill Evans, who said that improvisation is a reflection of the mind of the musician, shared both with himself and with the listener. So we are, as the improvisation is unfolding, learning about ourselves, discovering our own inner mind, so to speak, or the way that our brain works, indeed. So this leads me to applied insight number 2. Consider receiving unexpected events as a source of personal and creative insight. Can we experience these moments of unexpected events that are channeled through our movements, our vocalizations, whatever it might be, as something of interest, something that can captivate us and serve us, both as a window into our own, the inner workings of our own mind, but also as an opportunity for creative development. Okay, lovely. I thought I might pause for a second to give everyone a breather, also to ask questions. Is there a question that someone's okay if not? A question or comment would be welcome. No problem if not, though. Okay, lovely.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
Do we get a copy of the recording? Number 1, and number 2, is there a way to get a copy of the notes?
I can discuss that with the organizers afterwards to see what might be possible. And I would definitely love to stay in touch and to share these ideas in one form or another. It might be just sharing these notes with you, but let's definitely stay in touch, and we can make sure you get what you need.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. I see another hand raised. Michael Smollins. Yeah, hi.
Hi, Bradley. I have an observation about the last point that you made. I saw probably the most brilliant drumming from any local drummer a week ago when Dylan Vado played in a trio at Piedmont Piano, and his playing really had these elements of interjection and surprise that bordered on the quote that you mentioned by Oliver Sacks, but it was completely controlled. And so it had a very kind of theatrical feel to it. He wasn't being theatrical just to be theatrical, but the nature of what he was doing and the level of daring in the phrasing on top of some very complicated odd time music was just completely blew me away. And so that's when you said that point, I was going, oh yeah, my favorite musicians tend to, drive on that level of surprise.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, that's great. And actually it connects nicely with themes coming up about the relationship between pre-created versus completely spontaneous choices, you could say, in improvisation. But yeah, thank you for that. So that ultimately these findings are only worthwhile if they align with, as I mentioned, the phenomenology, the experience of improvisation as listeners and as performers. So it's very heartening to know that this is at least aligning with some of your intuitions and experiences. So thank you, Michael. That's
Sure,
great.
thanks.
Okay. Proceeding on. Okay, so I'd like to talk about another relationship with psychedelic research, and that being entropy. Okay, so this is probably the most famous image from the neuroscience of psychedelics to date. Let me explain what this is. Researchers at Imperial College London gave people psilocybin, the psychoactive chemical, the compound in psychedelic mushrooms, and compared whether they gave brain states associated with psilocybin versus placebo. Okay, so, oops, sorry, let me go back. So what they found, very interestingly, was that, oh, and by the way, so what we're looking at here, each of these circles is a different node in your brain, the brain network. The brain consists of different areas and different nodes that form networks through their communication. And so each circle corresponds to a different node in your brain, a structure or set of structures. And the lines that connect them are basically conversations going on. So placebo is more or less your waking state. Now, if you looked at deep sleep, non-REM sleep, you would see even fewer of these lines. But basically what you're seeing in your wakeful state is that there's a lot of communication. I mean, we have a very complex cortex, lots of interacting nodes that are enabling your wakeful conscious states. Under psilocybin, we see quite a marked increase in those conversations. So parts of the brain that aren't usually chatting away are suddenly very actively engaged in conversation. You have much stronger associations between areas that normally aren't connected. And what this is, there's an increase in complexity and what you can term mathematically as entropy, where entropy is the degree of unexpected events that are unfolding in the moment. So under psilocybin, there's just this marked quantifiable increase in entropy and complexity in the brain, interestingly. So this relates to a hypothesis put forward by Robin Carhart-Harris, who was at Imperial College London. He's actually now at UC San Francisco, continuing this research. But what he did was to create this hypothesis that accounts for these changes in entropy in the brain. And he referred to two different kinds of states. I'll start with secondary states and then get to the primary ones. But secondary states are associated with normal waking consciousness and experience. They are supported by the ego, so to speak, so self-awareness, a sense of being an individual, a separate self. They represent the world in such a way as to minimize surprise and uncertainty. So you're using your predictive model to best match with what you think is in the world, and you want to minimize the number of surprises. The illusions are examples of surprises, or briefly when you think your train is moving, but it's really the train next to you, and so on. These are examples of the rare kinds of surprises that happen in waking consciousness. Notably, these secondary states are associated with lower entropy. So there's less unpredictability. Things are more predictable. There's also less signal complexity in the brain. And this facilitates reality testing. So you're really applying that filter on your predictions. Your predictions are coming from implicit associations. They're very highly creative. The filter is there to narrow down so that what actually gets represented is as close as possible to what do you think is happening in the world. Now, in contrast, primary states are those that are associated with, that is, being found in association with psychedelic drugs and rapid eye movement sleep. And these tend to be pre-ego, so the presence of an individual separate self is less essential. It's not necessary. It's not as likely in these kinds of states. And there's an increase in the diversity and richness of experiential content. There's also mathematically this elevated entropy and signal complexity in the brain. And notably, reality testing is suspended to varying degrees. So in psychedelic states, of course, there can be hallucinations. You don't have that firm filter that's preventing the pareidolia, that is seeing faces and other human forms in inanimate objects and so on. That is happening more, and colors, etc. So basically, these expressions of the emotional self-referential states and associations are being expressed more to greater extents. Similarly, in dreaming, of course, you can have complete departure from the laws of physics and so on, for example. So reality testing is certainly suspended there. Now, what does this have to do with improvisation? So there has been quite an interesting study looking at entropy in the brain of improvisers and also listeners of improvisation. So this was another study conducted at Imperial College London. And what they did was to have live chamber music concert performances. So these are performances played by a professional trio. There's a voice, a flute, and a piano performer. And they played pieces in 2 performance modes for each piece. A strict mode, where they adhered to a prepared interpretation. They had practiced this interpretation and worked it out together. And then there was the let go mode, as they called it. This is an improvisatory approach with spontaneous expression, where they were free in the moment to vary note choice, even to some extent, but more so timing, emphasis, timbre, and so on, to create this more experimental approach that involved many more deviations from what you might expect in terms of their prepared approach. So there were 22 people in the audience, and notably half could only hear the performances. The other half could both hear and see the performances. And there was electroencephalography collected for all 3 of the performers and 4 of the audience members. And this was ultimately to look at complexity in the brain, so the degree of entropy. And they used a measure called LZ, or Lempel-Ziv complexity. This measures entropy and signal complexity in a way that is aligned with that entropic brain hypothesis framework that I mentioned earlier. They were also collecting data on motion tracking of the performers, and there was a questionnaire for participants about their experience of each piece. Okay, so what were the findings? What did they discover here? Well, looking at the experience of the performers, the phenomenology of these two different modes, they did report that there were seemingly distinct mental states associated with the two different modes of performance. So that's interesting and quite anecdotal, but it aligns with what we might expect as performers and also listeners. The audience rated, interestingly, the improvised versions as more emotionally compelling and more musically convincing, even when the performances were only heard. So the compelling nature of the music was communicated through the sound and the visuals, seeing the musicians perform. And there were more mind reading events reported in the improvised versions. They described or defined mind reading events as those moments where one musician deviates from the score by extemporizing notes, and another musician extemporizes in response instantly, creating together an unplanned yet coherent joint musical gesture that reaches a final goal point together. So this experience of sudden expression of joint creativity across the ensemble. So what of the complexity measures? Interestingly, they found that there was a higher level of this measure of entropy in the brain for the improvised version compared to the non-improvised versions. And that was true for both the performers and also audience members. So this state of higher entropy was shared with the audience. So not only the performers were showing this pattern in their brains, but also the viewers and listeners. Okay, so this leads to another insight, perhaps, that you could consider incorporating into your experience and performance as an improviser. So consider improvising with what you know. So in this case, these were pre-created, pre-planned scores. They weren't coming up with totally brand new material. They were just adding nuance to a composed piece. So we may think often as improvisers that you really have to do something new and completely out of this world and never heard before in order to create an improvised state of mind, the experience of that we're looking for with improvisation. But it's possible that nuances applied to material that you know very well, just adjusting timing, adjusting timbre, adding some deviations in terms of notes, can create very powerful changes neurologically. Here's a quote from jazz saxophonist Eric Alexander that I think brings this point home in terms of blurring the boundary between new music that you're creating in the moment and pre-composed music. I believe I got this off of a Better Sax interview online. Okay, let's see if this will play for you.
You know something will sound good, you still have to place it, which means that you have to be present and you have to feel the rhythm. So that's not a lick. I'm tired of hearing that. If you have a 4-bar phrase that you know will sound good, you still have to be in the moment and present and put it there. That's improvisation, actually. Because right before you're ready to place it, somebody might do something that throws you off. So you're improvising.
You're going to connect it to what came before and what's going to come after.
Yes, that's why there's very little difference, and Chick Corea made this point, between Glenn Gould and Charlie Parker. They knew what they were going to play before they played it. Now, everybody out there in radio, TV land, don't get offended. It doesn't mean Charlie Parker worked out his solos. He knew his harmonic template before he played it. And if you hear something, that means you know what you're going to play before you play it. Glenn Gould playing Bach, he is Bach. He plays as if he is Bach. He's improvising. If you don't think that way, you can't play Bach.
You're muted, Bradley.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to clarify, these pieces were classical musical pieces that were played in that experiment that I just described about entropy associated with improvisation. So Eric Alexander's point is that to play basically anything, you have to be in the moment in order to place it and make it fresh in the moment. So this, to me, really blurs the boundaries between every kind of musical performance, and I think really enhances the experience of whatever music you're listening to. The fact that this musician has to come into the present and create with the current situation, whatever it might be. And so there is improvisation. It also blurs the boundaries between the metacognitive state of improvising. That is, okay, I'm going to improvise now, or I'm going to listen to an improvisation. And really the rest of life, after all, you're improvising every time you pick up a cup. It's never been in exactly that state, that position relative to your arm, which has never been exactly the way it is before. And you're figuring out, negotiating the world, crossing streets, and preparing, driving, whatever you're doing, interacting with others, conversing. So there is improvisation everywhere in life. And it's just really interesting to see that intentional states of expressivity like this lead to brain changes that are shared with between the performers and also the audience. Okay. Right. So how is it that these brain states are shared, you might ask? And it's likely that these states can be shared through not only the sound, but also the body movements of musicians. They actually saw structured changes in the way that the musicians were moving. And it's been shown in research that body movements and postures reveal mental states, emotions, and intentions. This is likely no surprise. Nonverbal gestures are an important means of communication between individuals. Okay, of course, we're using facial expression, our hands, and so on to communicate ideas. But how is this loop completed where you're seeing someone express themselves and you're able to experience that and understand that as meaningful? So it turns out that we are modeling in our brains the movements of other people. And this is done by means of a mirror, what's come to be known as a mirror system in the brain that basically activates the brain in such a way that it predicts what it would be like to be that person doing that action. So you see someone open a door, and the part of your brain, the motor cortex and planning mechanisms and so on that would be involved in doing that yourself, become active in your brain as well. So there's a mirroring effect. What you're seeing around you is being mirrored in your own brain. And of course, this is what enables us to mimic other people, and we can get better and better at this, of course, through practice in a particular domain, whether that's music or otherwise. And notably, it is cross-modal in that this is true for sound as well as visual input. So if you hear the sound of a doorknob turning, you will actually model the movements that are involved in creating that sound. And this is true, of course, for music as well, where if you play a particular instrument, your representation of what's happening will be more accurate. But regardless, everyone can imagine what it is to bang a drum or to touch a piano. And so to some extent, you are, or with some level of resolution, you are always modeling the sounds that you're hearing as if you're creating them yourself. And this opens the door to communication through both sound and also gesture that is observed if you're watching someone perform on stage. And it is the basis of what has come to be known by Cassiopo and colleagues, emotional contagion. That is the tendency to experience yourself the emotions and mental states more generally of the people around you that you're interacting with. So just getting into music in particular, it has been shown that musicians' movements do communicate intended emotions, such as happiness, sadness, and anger. So even if you can't see the musician, you will experience the communication of these intended emotions. Interestingly, singers' facial expressions can alter the perceived pitch height and emotional quality of sung intervals. Movements of a percussionist significantly influence the perception of the length of a marimba note. So you can imagine, pianists that let their hand, the gesture continues, maybe even beyond the sound. That is having a perceptual effect. It is influencing our experience of the music, which of course is a creation of the mind and is being influenced by these multisensory inputs. And then interestingly, dance and music can convey similar experiences of emotion and structural form. So we can experience through both sound and sight and other senses these emotions, and they can work together or contrast and so on in interesting ways. Some work that I've done with other researchers at McGill has shown that seeing a musician can significantly impact the overall magnitude of emotion conveyed by a performance, particularly at pivotal points in the score. So the way a performer is moving can significantly alter your experience. Movements convey phrasing structure as well as the musician's interpretation of the score. And being able to see in addition to hear a musical performance, we found significantly increased the experience of positive emotions in general. So there's some kind of additive experience that may emerge from the interaction of seeing and hearing musicians, which is of course at play when you're either watching a performance or hearing one or creating one yourself. So there is this communication, of course, between the audience and the performer, both visually and through sound. And now I want to get into an interesting point about the expressive gestures of musicians. They are very common in performance, but they are not necessary in order to actually perform sound. So you can ask a musician not to move, and they can still ergonomically get the music out. But you will find that musicians often naturally move with the music in different kinds of expressive ways. So these are mostly unconscious, and much like paralinguistic gestures that you might find in speech. And these patterns of movement, and I'm going to show you an example of this, actually repeat with multiple performances of the same composition. So it's as if, as you're learning a piece, you're not only learning to create the sound, but also you're learning a pattern of expressive movements that reveal the intentions you have, and also your understanding of the structure of the piece. So let me show you this video. What you're going to see is a clarinetist performing the same segment of music 4 different times, but I've put it in a quadrant format so you can see them all at once, and you can notice, I hope, similarities in the gesture pattern across these 4 performances. We can watch it one more time just to capture the movements. So those movements are not ergonomically essential for creating the sound. She was able to play this piece basically still, more or less, but she naturally follows this particular sequence that she wasn't aware of. It's not like she planned those movements, when to place them, and so on. They developed as she learned the piece based on her interpretation of the score. So here what we see is a representation of the pattern of movements for that musician, actually. So each line corresponds to one performance, and what you're seeing is the height of a sensor placed at the tip of the bell. So you're just seeing this one vertical dimension, data reflecting the up and down movement of the bell, and time is here on the x-axis. And we've warped this so that all of the notes are aligned across the different performances, which of course varied a little bit in terms of timing. And what's remarkable is you have this incredible alignment in peaks and troughs. So clearly there's a repeated pattern going on. Now the red line corresponds to when we asked her not to move. So this is when she was constraining movement. She is able to play. There are some habitual gestures there that come into play, but which shows how overlearned this pattern of movement is. But indeed, when she's playing naturally, she's more or less repeating the same movement pattern with some variations. Now you might wonder, okay, maybe this is determined by the piece. This is another clarinetist performing that same exact segment, which by the way is a Stravinsky piece for solo clarinet. And you see that actually the pattern is quite different. There is the same continuity across multiple performances, but where the peaks and troughs are changes. And let me just flip back and forth a little to show you how different these are. There are some peaks where there weren't any in the other performance and so on, and overall a lot of changes with regard to the extent of movement. So this shows that what is true across the performers is that they are learning a pattern of movement when they learn the piece, but that pattern differs from one performer to another based on their interpretation, their feeling, their emotional expression with the piece. Okay, this leads me to applied insight number 4. Consider spontaneity of movement in addition to sound while improvising. So we are often very focused on the sounds that are coming out of our instruments or voice when we're thinking about and practicing music. Now, how much time are we considering the way we feel, the way the movements are unfolding? I have not had a chance to analyze an improviser, but I would guess that a lick probably is encoded along with a movement pattern. At least this is something worth looking at in our own movements. Do we repeat movement patterns when we're playing the same sequences within an improvised solo? And is it possible to have greater awareness and spontaneity in movement as an expression of our internal state in addition to the sound? Okay.
Question?
I'm going to take another pause here to see if there are any thoughts or questions that have accumulated. Anton.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. A couple of questions. One just with regard to what you just said. And I think maybe you were reflecting on the same thing in different words. I'm just wondering if you've done any, like made any effort to tease out causation from correlation in terms of the movement gestures and the musical gestures, if you will. You know, it could be that, right? I mean, it rains often when people have umbrellas out, but you wouldn't bring an umbrella to make sure it rains. So I'm just wondering,
Mm.
it could be a similar situation in which movement won't really affect the music, or we could see that it would. Any
Great question.
thoughts about experiment design there?
I wish I had a few more slides, but we did do analyses where we had a musicologist carefully analyze phrasing structure for multiple performers of this piece, and they differed in terms of their phrase interpretation, where the phrase boundaries were in the piece. And we found that there was a clear correlation between the interpretation communicated through sound and analyzed by the expert musicologist, and their movement patterns. So there were movement patterns that were indicative or that revealed these interpretations of phrasing structure. And interestingly, those were also communicated to observers. So if we looked at where people experienced phrasing boundaries, they were interpreted, they were influenced both by the sound and also by the visual experience looking at the performer. So that at least starts to get at your point with regard to the way that these are interrelated. Now, it would be interesting to go from the beginning and start with performers on a new piece and maybe to instruct some to interpret it a certain way and others to interpret it another way, and then to see how their gestures emerged as they learn the piece naturally. But I have not
Or even
done that study.
to instruct them to perform different gestures, like you could observe two different performers performing the same piece, look at their gestures, then instruct each other to mimic the other person's gestures and see what effect it has on the
Yeah,
performance.
that would be very interesting instead of letting this choreography emerge spontaneously, to actually create a choreography, or going the other way. Yeah, it could, if you had a choreography that you instructed them to use, would that then influence their interpretation that's communicated through sound? And yeah, I love that idea. And
It makes me wonder if there's some sort of universal choreography, because from what you say, audiences are getting an enriched experience when they're observing. So perhaps there's, universals of movement, the way there's universals of facial expressions.
Well, this has been long explored in music psychology research. So relationships between, you could say, envelopes of energy change for sound and for movement and gesture. And there's quite a bit of research that shows, yes, there are kind of these archetypal forms, you could say, that are based on deeply held implicit associations between changes over time in various senses and how they're expressed in music and otherwise. So I think you're probably right about that, that there are some archetypal associations that connect movement and sound, but definitely worth exploring that in a lot more detail. Yeah. Thank you, Anton. That's very helpful. And I see a hand raised from Michael.
Hey, Brad. Just a quick question. I'm curious, and as far as on the topic of shared brain states, as musicians, we've all played with a lot of different musicians in different contexts and different bands, even different musical genres. And I'm wondering if any studies have been done about the level of shared brain states, or the distinction between different brain states depending on members of the band. Like, for example, say Miles Davis and his band before George Coleman was basically ousted by Tony Williams. And after, when Wayne Shorter joined and finalized the second great quintet. And there's a vast difference in terms of the audience's reaction to the band previous to Wayne Shorter's joining the Miles Davis band. And then obviously the music had changed considerably when Wayne joined.
Yeah,
I just wanted to
that's a great question. So there has been research, and now I'm wishing I had another hour to go into more than we're going to cover here. But there is a literature looking at shared brain states between musicians, both in the context of chamber music with in classical, Western classical, but also in jazz. And what I've seen, what I've gathered from that is that there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that brain states align, they converge when performers are playing together. Now, that's not as subtle perhaps as what you're talking about, but no doubt based on those studies, but also what we just looked at in terms of entropy and interpretation, it's very likely that Miles Davis was looking or just exploring and foraging different options and looking for something that was going to be satisfying for him in terms of those shared brain states or what was being created for him. So I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about it.
yeah.
Development of an ensemble and choices in personnel, for sure. Yeah. Craig.
Yeah, thank you. The struggle I have with my improvisation is the thinking part about it, the analytical part about it, saying, okay, I've got a flat third here and a major seventh here, and the creative part about it, which, I've kind of described as right brain, left brain, but is that still valid that there's a right brain and a left brain, number one? And just the observation that, if I think about it and play all the quote right notes, it's just not as involving as just strictly letting go and winging it and maybe playing some sneaker notes, but telling a better story.
Yeah. So there definitely are specializations in the hemispheres. It ends up being a very complex story. So for example, normally for say a non-musician, language is very much lateralized to the left hemisphere, whereas music is skewed a bit to the right, although it's utilizing both hemispheres. Whereas in people that are more familiar with performing and become, you could say, fluent or more verbal or they're more expert with a particular mode of communication through music, they tend to use more left hemisphere areas, interestingly. There is research that I've seen in the creativity and neuroscience literature that suggests that the right hemisphere does have some special potential for creativity. It's definitely the area that's creating big picture associations and creating meaning and in ways that go beyond what's going on in the left hemisphere, which was more tending towards more analytical, basically subgroup focused perspective and analysis. So looking at elements, the left hemisphere is absolutely fantastic at labeling and looking at elements of a picture or of some sound. But the right hemisphere is great at bigger picture associations and thinking about melody, harmony, and so on. So I think we ultimately want to use both of our hemispheres to best effect as we need them. And then to your next point, I think that's absolutely great insight and perfectly aligned with what we're seeing in terms of the neuroscience of improvisation, that potential for creative expression involves a balance with your self monitoring and kind of filtering processes that are associated with these frontal cortical areas. So it's really you as a creative artist exploring that balance, and in the moment it maybe one way or another, or you want more or less. But that's really interesting that you're dabbling in that or exploring that. And it seems like you're right on. You're ahead of the neuroscience on this. It seems, Craig. So
All right.
that's
Thank you.
great to hear. Yeah. Okay, splendid. Thank you so much. Those are great questions. All right. So now, what's happening when you're learning music or really anything you're tapping into neuroplasticity? This is leveraging the fact that the brain is dynamic and changing with experience throughout life. And this is, of course, relevant to improvisation, as we just discussed. Maybe you're learning chord sequences or how to approach a particular piece and or a melody. So what's happening when we are going through that process? It involves neuroplasticity. There are many misunderstandings about neuroplasticity that still plague our culture, or common folk psychology, you could say, which I will take every opportunity to try to eliminate. So our brains are very plastic throughout life. They're changing. They are ever evolving. There are many functions of the brain that actually improve throughout life, including vocabulary and the value of intuition. There are certain kinds of creativity, like crystallized knowledge, that is taking all of the knowledge that you've come across from disparate areas of life and making sense of them, and then having the ability to communicate. This improves throughout life. So, for example, research shows that historians will peak in their 70s and even later in life, the works that are most relevant and influential. So eat your veggies, especially if you're a historian. But for all of us, we should be thinking about engaging our brains and utilizing neuroplasticity throughout life. And we even create new neurons throughout life. So neurogenesis is happening throughout life as we age. All right. So how does this actually work? So the wonderful neuroscientist Donald Hebb put it in perhaps the most well-known way, a very catchy phrase, or this phrase is attributed to him at least. It encapsulates his writings on the subject: neurons that fire together wire together. And this is basically saying that if neurons happen to fire at the same time, they will develop, physically change in such a way that it's more likely that they will again fire together. And this is underlying, if you multiply that by 100 billion neurons, each of which has 1,000 to 10,000 connections, so that's literally magnitudes of trillions of interconnections. And I heard it put that there are more possible brain states than there are particles in the known universe. So we have tremendously complex brains. And if you just take this one very simple rule that those neurons that fire together are going to wire together, you end up with this whole array of possible cognitive and behavioral states that humans enjoy. Okay, now this has been expressed not just by neuroscientists, but can be noticed by basically folks that are paying attention closely. So, for example, here's a great quote from Paramahansa Yogananda, who said that repeated performance of an action creates a mental blueprint, causing the formation of subtle electrical pathways in the brain, somewhat like the grooves in a phonograph record, and your life follows the grooves that you yourself have created. So another way to put this is that thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are taking place are basically increasing the probability of those same thoughts, feelings, and behaviors taking place again in future. And that's the way neuroplasticity is working. So how does this relate to music and improvisation? So we've talked a little bit about auditory motor associations already in the context of the mirror system in the brain. And it turns out that the brain is ready and rearing to develop these associations. So amazingly, research by Banger and colleagues found that just 20 minutes of practice on a piano for people that had never played or practiced before, these are adults, that led to significant changes in auditory and motor associations that were measurable. And of course, those associations only increased with additional practice. And it can get to the point where, for experts, you can see involuntary motor activity when listening to music that is highly accurate. So, for example, in this study by Hausen and Nosch, they were able to separately identify activity in the left little finger or the little finger and thumb when looking at so performers, these musicians were listening to a piece that they knew well, they had performed, and when they looked at activity occurring when the left little finger, or sorry, the little finger was being used so a note required the little finger to be used versus those situations where the thumb was required, they actually saw differential activity in the brain. So there's this highly refined representation of what's happening in music in the minds of musicians. And it's more and more refined the more familiar you are with what you're listening to. So if you're, a tenor player, it'll be pretty darn good for listening to alto players, but it'll be even more accurate when listening to a tenor player, and so on. So this is happening. These auditory motor associations are developing as you're learning your instrument. And of course, this is important for say transcribing music, being able to listen and then recreate on your instrument. There are also structural changes that are happening in the brain. So the size of relevant brain areas change with practice. You end up seeing an increase in the size of the corpus callosum. This is the structure connecting your two hemispheres. In practice musicians, of the auditory cortex, multimodal integration areas that are connecting auditory, visual, and motor processing are increased in size, and the motor cortex, unique to each instrument, and I'm going to show you how that works, but depending on how you're using your motor cortex, the areas associated with those patterns are going to increase in size. And these changes are very likely due to practice, not a predisposition for music. You might think, someone that just has an amazing, innate representation in the motor cortex for the hands would just end up playing piano because they're good at it. What the evidence suggests is that we start out without these kinds of enhancements, and that they develop through practice. So, for example, children randomized to music and non-music groups show a trend towards these differences mentioned above. Okay. And here's this example with the motor cortex where I said this is unique to the instrument you play. So what we see is the structure of a keyboard player on the left side and a string player on the right side. And this is the motor cortex representation of the hand area. And you can see it's, we're talking kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger level sized motor cortex representations for the hands, whereas for the string player, you get that, but only on the right side, which is the hemisphere that controls the left hand, which is the hand that requires the most manual dexterity for playing violin. Whereas the motor cortex of the left hemisphere, which controls the bowing hand, does not have this kind of fine-grained increase in size related to manual dexterity. So depending on the instrument you play, your brain is changing according to your practice. And of course, this isn't just the case for music, it's the case for literally every kind of activity that you partake in and become good at. And even activities that don't involve any motor activity at all. So we see brain changes associated with, for example, mindfulness meditation. So literally sitting in a place and just approaching thought or consciousness differently leads to changes in brain structures. So the research on mindfulness meditation has found that you have an increase in activity and volume in areas related to the control of attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. That is not, by that, I don't mean self-awareness as in the feeling of a self, but awareness of your internal states that develops for people that practice mindfulness meditation. Notably, this leads to certain interesting patterns in the brains of mindfulness meditators. So expert meditators show less habituation of the acoustic startle reflex. So what is this? This is where whenever you hear kind of a sharp sound, you have an automatic reflex that leads to a flinching of certain muscles in the face. There's also a neurological correlate of that, of course. And what they found is that whereas most people habituate, so when they hear this sound, this loud sound again and again, eventually the response dampens because we learn, okay, we, just like anything, we habituate to that. We don't need to respond. Whereas for meditators, the habituation is reduced. It's much slower and then reduced overall. So they are experiencing the sound as if it's fresh and new each time they hear it. And I haven't seen this study repeated with experts or very experienced improvisers, but I do suspect that a similar finding would be found there, where the improviser is entering into a state of present awareness and has practiced that state to the point where they're able to maintain the experience of freshness in the moment. But certainly it's been found with meditators, interestingly. So there has been some exploration. This is very recent. So I'm just kind of giving you a peek into an unfolding area of research looking at the structures that change for experienced meditators. And it does seem that there is a role here for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There's increased connectivity there with other areas of the brain. And this could be related to the inhibition of habitual responses. So certainly when we're playing, when you're improvising, we have kind of things that we're feeling that habitual pull towards, but we may use the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to help change to a different course. So we also see increased connectivity with the supplementary motor area, which is involved in the control of movement. So the relationship between these areas seems to be increased in strength, the connection between them in improvisers. We also see some interesting changes in areas involved in learning and also action-related categorization. So that's like recognizing a meaningful event, and that could be a chord sequence, it could be a note and a melody, the meaning of a note in the context of some harmonic flow, etc. So here, this is an unfolding area of research, as I mentioned, but they're seeing reductions in the size of some of these areas associated with practice with expert improvisers. Sometimes practicing something actually leads to greater efficiency in that area and a reduction in size. But we shall see how this plays out. It's quite interesting that we're seeing the changes in these areas related to learning, memory, and categorization, though. Okay, so what gets you as musicians and music lovers to engage so much with music to the point where your brains are changing as improvisers, as musicians more generally. Now, what is it about music that motivates us? Well, it turns out that quite a bit of research has shown that music activates the reward system in the brain. So the same regions that are associated with other rewards like food, sex, and drugs are activated by music. So in particular, or more specifically, enjoyment of music is associated with the release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens of the striatum. And this is an area that's involved in movement, habitual learning, and reward. And it's been shown that a lack of enjoyment of music, so some people suffer from musical anhedonia, which is a lack of enjoyment, is associated with weaker nucleus accumbens responses to music. So you have a decrease in activity in the reward circuitry, and also a decrease in connectivity between auditory cortex and the striatum being this reward related center of the brain. So there's a clear connection between the reward circuitry and the enjoyment of music. So there's other evidence that suggests that music is quite uniquely emotionally engaging. So a lot of things in life are engaging, but music has certain unique qualities that set it apart. So for example, maternal singing is more effective than speech for calming distressed infants. So from very early in life, we see that music has certain kinds of seemingly magical powers to modulate the experiential state and basically bring us to a state of homeostasis. From early in life, musical sounds increase the concentration of pain-suppressing beta endorphins. They normalize hormones related to stress, including cortisol. Music improves mood, physical performance, and oxygen consumption during exercise, very interestingly. Music reduces pain and the need for opioids. Research with people undergoing surgery and suffering from chronic pain has shown this. And we also see that there are many medical applications of music, and this is worthy of whole areas of research, but there are music-based treatments for Parkinson's, stroke recovery, for cancer patients, for facilitating improvements in Alzheimer's and other neurological and physical challenges. And it's been shown that participating in musical ensembles improves immune system response in measurable ways, and singing and playing air-driven instrument. I mean, here like voice, and if you're blowing into an instrument, this activates the parasympathetic nervous system that facilitates a calming effect. So the kind of relaxation, the opposite of fight or flight, you get this kind of relaxing experience that is helpful for stress. So these are all potential motivators, but there is something unique about improvisation. It does have certain qualities that make it a very powerful driver for the reward system in the brain. So improvising, you can see it as a kind of, as analogous to gambling in a way. What drives the reward system most is variable and unexpected rewards. So unexpected rewards are very strong drivers for developing habit and craving. And ideally, the timing and form of the reward should vary for maximum effect. And of course, this is why gambling is so incredibly powerfully attractive especially for some people that are prone to addiction. So it built into that system is simply random reward. You don't know when that reward is going to come. And there's been plenty of research about how to hook people, so to speak. And if you were going to develop a system, improvisation would be a perfect technology, so to speak, for capturing people's interest and developing long-term habits. And why is that? Well, it's an ideal variable reward system. So when musicians are improvising, you never know when a particularly engaging moment will happen. You don't know what form that type of engaging, rewarding experience will take place. And this could very well be why there's this addictive quality for both performers and listeners. You know, musicians playing in lofts all night, deep into the day. You know, people, you know, going to concerts and so on to enjoy this music. There's something that is tremendously rewarding about this uncertainty that's associated with improvisation. So what exactly constitutes reward in music? So the word reward is variable, but what is rewarding in the context of these improvisations? Well, there's been research showing that rhythms and their associations with embodied experiences can be rewarding. So reflecting heartbeat, breathing, walking, running, romantic gestures. I'll leave that to your imagination. The rhythms of these different kinds of actions can be mirrored in music in ways that activate associations with these pleasurable experiences. Contours of change actually have been shown to mirror the physics of moving bodies in nature. So the physics of an object thrown through the air actually are mirrored in ritardando, accelerandos, and crescendos, decrescendos. And so you get this kind of recreation or tapping into the sense of movement through music, tracking the evolving relations between tones and harmony. Of course, we're mapping these harmonies based on our cultural experience and expectations, and this is leading to moments of reward in interesting ways. Even just the basic sound, the joy of hearing timbre, our nervous system is set up to experience harmonics in a way that's very pleasing and interesting, and that's of course utilized to great extent in the context of music. And then familiarity. So there's something in psychology called the mere exposure effect. And this is basically the finding that the more you experience something, the more you enjoy it. And that is, of course, true for hearing your favorite performer or hearing a piece of music that you're familiar with, and so on. Further to that, importantly, there's a role to play for expectations. So research and theory related to music psychology has long explored how the creation and deviation from expectation based on both the culture at large, but also within a particular piece or improvisation, leads to rewarding experiences. And this is based on the fact, and we've alluded to this earlier in the context of talking about consciousness, but the brain can be seen as a prediction machine. You are very much interested in knowing if there's going to be a friend or foe coming in one form or another. And so we are predicting the world as it unfolds. And indeed, music has a tremendous amount of structural content that the brain can utilize to form predictions. So think of a rhythm. You have a meter, and once you have that meter established, then that creates a landscape of probabilities where you can anticipate when the next event will take place based on what has come before. Similarly with melodic contours and patterns there that lead to expectations. Harmonic sequences, of course, based on our experience and culture or within a piece lead to expectations, and then timbre as well. And for this reason, music is really the quintessential catnip for the predicting brain. This is why musical memories are so deeply ingrained in our brains and so long lasting. Thus, we have tremendous nostalgia that is associative memories that are triggered by hearing music. But also, it's been shown that musical memories are some of the most durable, even in the context of neurodegeneration. People that aren't responding to very much in the world will seemingly come alive when listening to music that's familiar to them from earlier in their life. So it has this tremendous capacity to access representations of the self and associations. So of course, this is what these are the tools in the tool shed of the improviser, is utilizing all of this structure in order to create associations and emotional content. There's also this rewarding state of flow. So flow being this state of being challenged at your peak level of skill and still succeeding. So total absorption says a tremendous positive valence. So music, of course, meets the bill for this. It's an infinite system that you can continually be developing within. There's also in jazz, certainly, and in other traditions, you have quotes. So you may refer to another piece in the improvisation that you're currently exploring. And what's happening here is that you are connecting across disparate semantic associations. And Mendelssohn has a nice quote here: "The thoughts which are expressed to me by a piece of music which I love are not too indefinite to be put into words, but on the contrary, too definite. Indeed, we are building musical associations from birth, so we acquire culturally specific musical associations quite early in life. So for example, by the age of 7 to 8, we've learned that the minor mode is sad and the major mode is happy. Notably, this is not universal. We are learning this through our cultural context. And by the age of 6 or so, children have learned to associate musical properties with story characters. So certain attributes of sound will become associated with certain kinds of characterizations and so on. And of course, if you expand this to all of culture, seeing music paired with different visuals and storylines in movies and throughout life, TV and so on, radio, you end up with this kind of similar representation. There's a language that's shared by people in a culture, and Tag put it this way: music communicates specific meaning understood by listeners immersed in the musical culture. So we have kind of this common awareness of music. And this has been studied with neuroscience. It's been shown that music has both universal emotional associations and also culturally specific ones. Music directly activates linguistic associations. If you look at the priming, there are priming effects whereby if you hear a piece of music, it will activate linguistic associations. Basically, I'm trying to say that often we think of music as totally non-referential. This is abstraction, whereas language is referential. It refers to things in the world. The reality is much, much more blurred than that. Music is activating linguistic associations. And you end up with, in the context of improvisation, when you're quoting or making references to other works, you're basically connecting these different semantic networks in interesting and novel ways. And this is kind of like a puzzle, a little puzzle. We love easy, simple puzzles. And that's what you're doing as a listener. And you hear this, you're connecting, and you hear and you recognize. There's also, speaking of simplicity, simplicity is a powerful driver for engagement and reward. So it turns out the brain is very, very metabolically expensive. So what do I mean by that? Well, it takes up about 2% of your body weight, but it uses about 20% of your energy in the form of sugars and so on. So for this relatively small part of your body, it's using an enormous amount of your resources. And perhaps for this reason, we are a bit lazy, I would say, where we don't much like very difficult problems. We want to find the easy way. And this is also, the simplicity is also rewarding due to cognitive constraints. There's just only so much complexity we can manage, and therefore we are attracted when there is clarity and simplicity. This is just a picture of an Apple store. There's certainly variety there. There's something interesting that suggests it's worth exploring, but at the same time, it's not overwhelming in terms of its complexity. So they're leveraging simplicity in order to draw people in to what's happening. So here are some thoughts about simplicity that are echoed by folks involved in jazz. Again, Bill Evans, who said, let's see, actually I have his quote. Let me let you listen to him in his own voice.
I personally want to reach as many people as possible, and I try to put whatever I can do into the most common terms. If there were any way to put it more simply, I would do it.
And here's Thelonious Monk saying something similar.
I'm not trying to disguise nothing to stop people from hearing and digging it. I want it to be easy as possible so people can dig it, and still it'll be good, A lot of my songs is like that. It's easy to,
Notably, he was not playing there. He was actually describing what he would like to do in contrast to what the producer in that clip of the video, the documentary Monk was playing. But clearly he also sees value in simplicity. It's kind of interesting that these two musicians that seem to me and maybe to others to be some of the most sophisticated and complex in terms of the depth of their conception, are so determined to be simple, and that's their ultimate goal. Just a personal quote, personal communication from a professor at William Paterson University who said, the challenge with young improvisers is not a lack of ideas, but having too many ideas.
I personally.
Next slide. So here's applied insight number 5. Consider doing more with less. Can we simplify life? And I'm sure you think about this and hear this from educators in improvisation, but how can we really get down to the basics and be very patient and use much less material and things we have a solid feel for, and build upon that slowly and systematically and very patiently. The neuroscience would certainly support that effort or that perspective. Okay, so I have one more section here, and then we'll get to questions. So I want to talk about the dissolving of boundaries of mind, and we touched on this earlier in a couple of ways. The mind reading in this high entropy state of those musicians, and also this dissolving of boundaries of mind being characteristic of these primary states, as described by the entropic brain hypothesis. So this phenomenology of ego dissolution is common in the discussion of improvisation. So I saw Billy Higgins at Yoshi's playing, and he said, "We are not playing the music, we are the instruments of what he called the Most High." Charles Lloyd, "The music is not my music, I am a conduit. It comes through me, I am in service." Albert Eiler and Roshan Roland Kirk were both speaking of having received musical ideas through visions. Eric Dolphy spoke of aiming to achieve telepathy with other musicians. And you probably have many other examples. If you do, please share them. But clearly this phenomenology of ego dissolution, of the loss, this transpersonal experience, is common in the way at least some musicians speak of, some improvisers speak of their experience. And certainly it's present in various forms. We just look at the titles of different albums, Ascension, Spiritual Unity, a collective improvisation, transpersonal experiences like Interstellar Space, nothing is, two of a mind, unity, and so on. These all reflect or reference these transpersonal states that involve dissolving of boundaries between the self and others. So how could this take place? We've actually, amazingly, in the context of the psychedelic research that's been going on, started to characterize the neurological correlates of states of ego dissolution, or the dissolving of these boundaries. So in this research by Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues, they were looking at the relationship between the default mode network, which is your internally aware system in the brain that's active when you're daydreaming and just letting ideas flow and connected with emotional associations, versus the task positive network, which is involving a different system that is focused on what's happening in the world around us. So it's awareness of the activities in the environment, for example. And these, it turns out that there's an interesting relationship here that can give us an insight into what's happening in relation to ego dissolution and transcendence. So while in this study, while people were pre-psilocybin, so they had not taken the drug, and this is characteristic of our normal waking states, there's basically an alternation between the default mode and the task positive network. So we are either focusing outside of us, or we're letting the internal states, rumination and mind wandering and so on, occur. So it's one or the other, and kind of we're switching in between those throughout the day in waking awareness. Then when they gave people the psilocybin, what they found was afterwards, when people had experiences associated with the dissolving of boundaries, transcendence, and wonder, there was a significant increase in the correlation between these two systems in the brain. So instead of them working in a countervalenced way, one is up, the other down, they started to move together, swelling together. And so this, it seems to me, could account for, or at least align with or explain what's happening during performance of music, where there's the experience of ego dissolution. In fact, performing, and in particular improvisation, may be ideal for driving neural circuits in this way, because you have this simultaneous inward focus and awareness associated with the default mode network. Where are your ideas and emotions coming from? Your creative expression, but also an outward awareness related to the sound being created by you, by others, the ensemble and the music. And this is going to activate the task positive network. So basically, these need to work together in complete unity in order to realize these ideal states of improvisation. And that seems to be what we're seeing here, created by, in this case, psilocybin, this coordination between those different networks in the brain that leads to ego dissolution and transcendence. And these states, it turns out, are proving to have quite interesting value in different ways. You could say they are proving to benefit the individual. So if we start with dreaming, there are actually therapeutic benefits of dreaming that have been studied. And it seems that dreaming basically helps process emotional content. So difficult emotional experiences come up in dreams, and we experience them. They are uninhibited, so we don't have that filter that's preventing what it is that we would normally want to not think about. It's just coming up. It's unfiltered, these emotional states and associations. But interestingly, and something I didn't mention before, is that while dreaming, there is a suppression a reduction in stress-related hormones. So the kinds of surging, stress-related hormones that would come up when someone insults you, or when you have a very difficult situation in life, or stressful context in life in some way. In waking life, of course, you have all this stress, but in dreaming, somehow there's a reduction in that kind of stress-related hormone activity. And this allows, at least the theory goes, by Walker, who is here at UC Berkeley doing this research, and others, that this allows the processing. You're able to experience these challenging experiences without the stress, and that allows for processing and integration that allows for growth and development as a person. So we are thankful for our dreams for this reason. You may be wondering, why is it that I am, why do I seem to be stressed out when I have a dream? Well, it's hypothesized that actually the stress is all coming upon wakefulness with the evaluation of what you just went through in that dream, and you feel the stress hormones kick in at that point. But during your dream, there's a reduction in stress hormones, interestingly. And what are we seeing with improvisation? Well, you have the expression of this implicit emotional material when we're reducing activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And also music itself, it has this suppressing effect on stress hormones. So basically, you could say that a very similar process, or something that's analogous, is happening when we are improvising. Then if we look at psychedelic therapies, these are proving to be very helpful for treating seemingly intractable depression, people suffering addiction, end-of-life anxiety, and other kinds of ailments. There's a growing evidence that psychedelics can help where we've fallen short with other kinds of pharmaceutical and behavioral interventions for decades. So there's an opportunity for psychedelics to enable this kind of benefit. And interestingly, the degree of the benefit correlates with how much people experience these kinds of transcendent states, deeply personally meaningful experiences such as ego dissolution. So being able to get into those high entropy states, those ego dissolving states, actually determines whether you will benefit from these kinds of treatments. So again, drawing the connection with improvisation, if we can create these high entropy states, allow for the expression of this implicit emotional material, and achieve these transpersonal ego dissolving states, that may have really interesting effects, maybe even benefits psychologically and otherwise. And then finally, touching on meditation. So it's been shown that meditation and psilocybin have very synergistic effects. So meditation may facilitate long-term benefits, beneficial effects of psilocybin, and psilocybin has been shown to facilitate a deepening of the meditation practice. So there's a synergy, as I mentioned, between those. And that leads to my last applied insight. Consider incorporating meditation into your practice of improvisation. Maybe beforehand, after. It just seems that these kinds of technologies, whether it's, in this case, psychedelics, working with meditation, mindfulness meditation, can lead to benefits in both directions. So is there a way to merge meditation and jazz or improvisation to create a mutually beneficial, synergistic relationship between those activities? Okay, so just to review, we've had these applied insights, and can share this with you. Certainly, we'll find a way to do that, but if it's of interest. So consider noticing and even modulating the involvement of self-evaluation and volitional control while improvising. Receive unexpected events as a source of self-knowledge and creative insight. Consider improvising with what you know, consider spontaneity of movement in addition to sound while improvising, and consider doing more with less. And then finally, consider incorporating meditation into your practice of improvisation. So these are building on what we've learned from the neuroscience of improvisation and related areas of inquiry. And I'd like to leave you with reference to nature. So of course, nature is always the model and inspiration for art and life in general. And the supreme example of improvisation in nature is the ocean, ever changing, ever spontaneous, ever fascinating and engaging. And there's a rich tradition exploring the nature of the ocean in Indian philosophy. So I'm going to play you a quote by someone who writes about this, and in particular, this quote is about the writing of a poet from the south of India, known as the greatest poet of Tamil, Mahakavi C. Subramaniam Bharati.
Om is supposed to be the fundamental sound of creation. So all music comes out of the basic vibration of Om. Bharati wrote about that, and it's actually an Indian tradition. So he says the sound of the ocean is the sound Om. It's the primordial sound out of which all music is born. Om.
Sorry. And with that, thank you so much. I would love to stay in touch. Here's an email address, or I'm sure we can get in touch. Otherwise, I'm on LinkedIn, and let me open it up to questions and thoughts. Let's see here. So, Josh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I have two questions for you. One is, are there any useful studies in the neurologic literature on known jazz improvisers who have had strokes and neuropsychological studies done on them? Is
Great question.
Examples in jazz history?
Yeah, great question. There have been case studies of people who have had strokes and looking at their process of recovery. I've even heard of a case study where a violinist had a stroke affecting their finger dexterity, and they relearned the instrument with their other hand, and actually went on to return to the orchestra in which they were playing before that. Nothing that the specific case studies are not springing to mind, but there definitely are examples, and maybe if we can follow up afterwards, I can point you to those. But there are really interesting case studies where you have damage to language centers but preserved music abilities, and vice versa. So it's certainly an area of active research, and one of the areas of research that I've done is looking at how music can help recovery for stroke patients. So using singing, for example, to recover speech. So there are very interesting interactions between music and stroke. Absolutely. Thanks for raising that.
My second question is more broadly about dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and drugs. There's a history in jazz of heavy drug use, both opiates and alcohol, and probably other drugs as well. Art Tatum famously drank pitchers of beer while he was performing this virtuoso piano. Is there any understanding of any kind of drug in relationship to either dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? Is there, there's always these arguments whether drugs made jazz musicians play better, or whether it was they played well despite the use of drugs. Is there any understanding of that? I mean, it was interesting. You had a slide that said that there was a decrease, that playing music led to a decrease in use of opioids in certain patients. I mean, that's sort of the opposite of the history of jazz.
Right. Yeah, so the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which we've been talking about as a filtering mechanism, as this way of controlling the expression of emotional habits and so on. This is a center that's really important for controlling our habitual tendencies, and indeed is essential if we want to prevent habits that we don't want to have happen. So there's a very clear relationship between decreased activity or decreased connectivity between these areas and limbic system reward circuitry that is associated with addiction. So there's just an inability to control these propensities, these drives. So definitely the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex plays a role in that. In that way, it's having less of that ability is the problem. The case with the opioid relation with opioids is looking at people undergoing some kind of procedure, and then turns out that simply playing music has this analgesic effect whereby they require less opioids to they will just ask for less of these analgesics, these opioids, in order to be comfortable, to remain comfortable. So it's a complex thing. It's maybe that, we've talked about improvisation as being it's kind of has this compulsive nature to it, and people that get really involved in that might also be prone to addiction in other areas. It's possible that there's a relationship there, but I have not seen that studied enough, or at least in a way that would directly address your question. But it's certainly interesting that there are those relationships, for sure.
So should we take psilocybin before we improvise the next time?
Oh, I don't know that, and that research hasn't been done. Psilocybin comes with a big fat warning label in that it can create all kinds of havoc. It's creating neuroplasticity that could lead to the expression of very challenging psychological material. So Oregon is making it legal, but only in the context of a therapist being present and so on. So I think, but there is no doubt ongoing personal exploration here, and eventually we'll do some good research to see what the effect is, if it's interacting in a positive way or not. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you, Josh. Jojo, hello.
Yeah, my question is the same as, it's back to the psychedelics. Like, if you have a musician who's just been rigidly trained in the classical sense, and improvisation is a sin, trying to break through that. I'm just wondering if there's been any studies or any research on the application of, utilizing psychedelics to help build those new neural pathways to allow one to kind of venture out of the zone that they might have actually been punished for doing, when they were, I'm not speaking from experience, let's put it that way. It's almost like breaking the law to improvise because of how I was trained musically. And yeah, I'm dabbling, with it a little bit to see where it goes.
Great.
And so I'll let you know.
Okay.
If I have a psychotic break, or I have some amazing musical piece that comes out of it. But my other question before I let go is, also I was changed. I'm just wondering what the neurological impact of it being a left-handed person, but then being forced to be right-handed, both on instruments as well as handwriting and all that, and how, like you were just talking about these people who switch sides after an injury. So anyway, I didn't know if you had any research in that, because for me, it kind of caused a degree of dyslexia. But anyway, Those are
Yeah.
my two
Great
areas.
questions. And
Thanks.
it is really great that you're exploring improvisation and incorporating that. And I think one of the insights that I wanted to share is that there's really a blurred boundary, and just taking something that you see as pre-composed, but approaching it with an improvising mindset, or just a different mindset, that can be enough to open up different kinds of states of mind and certainly brain patterns. So there is research looking at the relationship between psychedelics and creativity. Absolutely. So divergent thinking, the ability to come up with new ideas, it does seem that it unlocks this. People seem to be more creative, at least according to that definition. Now, there's also research looking at whether psychedelics can help people achieve breakthroughs in their particular area of interest. And certainly there have been anecdotes of this, a physicist saying they were inspired by, experience with LSD that led them to their Nobel-winning new understanding of genomics or something like that. And there are a few of these scattered through the history. And it's very possible that will lead to interesting breakthroughs like what you're saying. But I think in general, this would be definitely something worth exploring, just helping artists to realize their full potential, even within a tradition, but certainly expanding beyond. That could be an interesting avenue, but it hasn't been done yet. That's a great question, for sure. Yeah, thank you, Jojo.
I think we need to do a study.
We need to do a study. That's right. Yes.
Any volunteers on here?
Yeah. Michael, back to you. Yeah.
Bradley. So I had a question about the inner versus the outer network. I read a really great book by Joanna Lear called How We Decide. And he describes the decision-making process, no matter if we're deciding what color jacket to buy or something much more complex, as this balance between the fear impulse, which is in the insula part of the brain, and the novelty pleasure-seeking impulse, which is in the NCAA part of the brain, kind of mediated by the rational part, the prefrontal cortex. So I see that a lot in terms of students trying to navigate their desire to stay in their lane and stay with whatever improvisation context they want to master, and yet still want, novelty. So I'm kind of curious about where do these inner and outer networks that you're describing map on with the fear or the novelty-seeking parts of the brain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they're a little bit different, I would say, certainly. So the default mode network and the task positive network, or the focus network, involve different areas of the brain, from the limbic system, for example, that's involved in fear. Now, all the different systems are connected in one way or another, and will be underlying the process. But I would say, what comes to mind is that improvisation can be seen as kind of foraging. It's the equivalent of exploring, looking for something, and at some point you get a reward. In fact, learning anything is kind of like that, but especially music, where it's like, I'm blowing, ooh, and then the saxophone comes alive. Okay, that was my big first reward, and now there's one reward after another, discovering things just by semi-random, but sometimes guided by an instructor. And so you discover this hierarchy of pleasure that you can garner from music. So yes, breaking free and looking for that next level may require getting a little bit uncomfortable doing things that you wouldn't normally do. But maybe encouraging that foraging process, let's just say, to see if you can get that next bump, that reward, because this is a self-reinforcing process. Because if you get a reward, it's going to lead back to the habit that led to that reward, practicing something or exploring something, and that will open up the individual. But I think, kind of like we've been talking about, small changes can lead to big differences. So even starting small may just open the door to a long line of explorations that could be very beneficial.
And you're saying that that's more about the outward network that you described earlier?
Well, this task positive network and the default mode network, they're both so important for expression in general. And I think it's a great practice to introduce, to explore linking those. I think that's what musicians are doing anyway, but we can get better and better at doing that, being aware, listening. How many times have you told your students to listen to what's going on? So listening, but also having the skill to listen while also being open to what content is emerging from implicit emotional associations. That's kind of the challenge, or the kind of juggling act that is part of achieving these ego dissolution states.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thomas, hello. Yeah.
Hi, Brad. Early on, you talked about the frontal cortex being suppressed, and that bringing on a greater fluency in improvisation and that process. And it associated immediately with me with this continuum of being ego-less or being hypersensitive of your own ego. I struggled for many years with stage fright in performing, and I've managed to get a lot of that under control. But I realized that the more aware you are of yourself and the more uncomfortable you are on stage, the further you are away from that non-ego state of being a good improviser. So how much further do I have to go before I can really cut loose on a horn? I mean, along that scale. I mean, is that the same mechanism, two ends of the whole continuum?
Yeah, so you've raised the idea of performance anxiety, and there is a really rich literature exploring how to overcome performance anxiety, which is very extremely common and natural. But this is related to it. The awareness of self, we're talking about the dissolving of boundaries. That's kind of the opposite of the feeling of walking out on stage and in front of people and feeling self-conscious. So there is a spectrum here, but even moving a little bit in one direction or another could lead to very meaningful changes in your experience. And being able to access, knowing that state is even available, and then thinking, okay, I'd like to move in that direction, might open the door to realizing that state. So I think maybe the big takeaway for me and others is there is such a state, and perhaps I can play with moving towards that or exploring it more as I'm performing, knowing that it's there for me if I can just let it in, let it happen. Yeah. Thantastic. Thank you. Oh, Dr. Patrick, Dr. Gannett.
Yes, hi there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Brad. Really interesting presentation. I had a question about this concept of brain entrainment and the idea of manipulating the brain to be in a certain mental state that encourages improvisation or encourages learning. Cardio exercise supposedly will downregulate the prefrontal cortex to, redirect blood flow to the motor parts of the brain. And that creates some openness, I think similar to what you're talking about here. But can you talk a little bit about that concept of being more active in terms of how you intervene with your brain?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, brain hacking is all the rage. How can we, in various ways, adjust the way that we're performing in all different aspects of life. So exercise is just this incredible way to get the brain going. I mean, it's a cognitive, being that the brain is, it's affected by the cardiovascular system, because as we talked about with functional magnetic resonance imaging, this is a measure of blood flow. So if we have good cardio, then our brain is going to work better. So that's a pretty straightforward connection there. And as far as influencing different states, yes, we can. I talked about the study where they applied transcranial direct current stimulation to encourage certain states of mind, and that has clear effects on behavior. But we can also affect those areas through our volition. So, either trying to be self-aware and volitional in our actions, or trying not to be so, can modulate this part of the brain and have clear effects depending on our experience level. So I would say that's interesting. Actually, I did not know about the connection between exercise and reducing dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity. And moving activity to motor areas. So, one way to overcome, you might have just answered the question about stage fright, to maybe do a few jumping jacks and to kind of get you focused on the body and less on this ever present pressure of self-awareness that we have. So that's an amazing insight and idea. Thank you so much, Dr. Gannon. Yeah. Let's see. Anton, you had another thought.
Great. Thanks so much. I was just wondering, you spoke earlier on about the meaningfulness of, how did you say it, of the findings sort of aligning with the phenomenology of how we experience these states and improvisation. And I'm just wondering if there have been any occasions in which you find that not to be the case. So for instance, as a reed player, you can relate to some it's great to have a really easy blowing mouthpiece, but there are mouthpieces that are not easy blowing but yet sound great, right? Or reeds occasionally that perform really well even though they don't feel right. And when I was looking into the psychology of skill acquisition, there's a whole bunch of things there where it turns out that the most effective and efficient states to be in when you're learning skills are very counterintuitive. They're not at all flow states, right? You want to, what is the measure? I guess most efficient remyelination occurs when you're remembering things that you've forgotten, and so it's really frustrating and all that. And I'm just wondering, if there's anything comparable that you've come upon where this is an area, improvisation, I would think, where the phenomenology ought to coincide with the quality of the result to a large extent, because when you're feeling that flow state is when the magic happens on stage. But I'm just wondering if there's anything that you found that's been a little counterintuitive along those lines.
I mean, I thought it was counterintuitive that a decrease in brain activity would be associated with higher quality performances. So that's interesting. But certainly, we've been focusing here on kind of the end state of the road of much preparation in order to develop some content, even if it's simple, that you could then explore in a creative way. There's going to be practice, deliberate practice, and lots of it. And most of your practice sessions will not be spent in an ego dissolved state of so you're going, yes, it's going to be systematic, and yes, research on skill acquisition shows that there are certain things you need to do, and it's going to involve creating context independence and spreading effort out over time and all kinds of ways to maximize benefits of practice. And it's usually, yes, there's a disconnect between our experience of how well we're progressing and how well we're actually progressing, and so on. So you can, if it's not hard and frustrating, and if you're not feeling like you're failing, you're actually you are failing. So that's the state that's associated with making progress, as opposed to if it's feeling easy and it's like, oh, I got this, let me play that again, like, then you're kind of plateauing or maybe even losing opportunity to grow. So I think maybe that's a good example of something unintuitive that, when I would practice, I would start on a piece and I would stink the first time I played, and then keep going at it. And eventually, after 10, 15, 20 minutes, I've got it. But that's actually not the best way to go. You want to work on things in blocks where you go to it, come back, go to something random, otherwise go back to it, and then self-evaluate. Oh, I really haven't gotten this when I try it for the first time, and so on. So I think that's quite an interesting point, that our experience of progress is not aligned with long-term progress in interesting ways.
But they tend to align when it comes to being in the moment, as opposed to building future abilities. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. That's true. You kind of know when you're in the flow, or when things are, you're arriving at that state, that ultimate state that is a direct experience, that you can kind of put a pin in and say, I got there at least once. So let me keep striving to stretch that or get there more often, or whatever it is. But it sounds like you're onto this literature, Anton. So, but
it's crazy addictive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
No, thank you. Is there anything I didn't cover? Any other questions? I just so appreciate your interest and your thoughts. Amazing questions. It's really fantastic to learn a little bit about your background for those of you who shared when you registered. By the way, the background that I'm using, I got on free pick by an artist called Starline. It's in the Creative Commons. I just needed to mention that. And I really hope we can stay in touch, and I'd love to hear you speak quite a bit more and turn the tables and learn more about your experiences and so on.
Would you kindly put your email address up one more time?
Oh, sure. Let me put it in the oh, yeah, I can do that. Just a moment here.
Are there any good books for a layperson to read on the subject?
I would
that
say
you could recommend.
Yeah,
put it in chat.
Okay, yeah, I can make some suggestions for sure. Use this screen with an email address. I'll put actually I'll put my personal email address into the chat. Here's another one. In case you want to reach out, would be delighted to chat. And then for books, my gosh, there's so many wonderful books. The book Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is kind of one of the great ones. So that's just Flow is the title of that.
Okay.
And I showed, it depends on what level you want to approach this. If you want to get into the weeds of the research, then
or like from the perspective of a musician, I'm by no means a neuroscientist.
Yeah, I think Kenny Werner's work on effortless mastery really aligns quite nicely with a lot of, and he just came out with a new book, so a little plug for him and his work. That could be a good place to look just for practical experience. You won't see a lot of neuroscience there. But I'll try to think of other things. If you email me, I'll
Sure.
Anyone who emails me and says you want to be on a listserv, then I'll share some updates and so on via email. Beautiful. Well, really wonderful. And thank you so much again for your interest and for sharing your thoughts. I'm really looking forward to staying in touch, and hopefully we can put this to the test and see if it works or not. But I do hope this gave you some inspiration.
Thank you for the insights.
Yeah, excellent.
My absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
And thanks for Rob and the California Jazz Conservatory for organizing this. Much appreciated all. Yeah.